On a spring day in 1828, a teenage boy walked into Nuremberg carrying a letter, barely able to speak, barely able to stand, and apparently unable to explain who he was or where he had come from. He said his name was Kaspar Hauser. He seemed to know almost nothing of ordinary life. He moved awkwardly, reacted strangely to light and food, and repeated simple phrases as if language itself had only recently reached him. At first glance, he looked like a lost child. But the deeper people looked, the less natural the story became. Was he a fraud, a victim, an abandoned noble, or the living center of a political secret someone had tried to bury? That uncertainty is why Kaspar Hauser still feels less like a solved biography and more like one of history's strangest human apparitions. The surviving story begins with a scene so theatrical that it almost seems designed to provoke disbelief. On May 26, 1828, the boy appeared in Nuremberg with a letter supposedly addressed to a cavalry captain. The note claimed that the child had been entrusted to the writer years earlier and had been raised in isolation, taught almost nothing except a few prayers and the ability to write his name. The boy himself seemed to confirm parts of this strange upbringing. He said he had spent his life in a dark cell with little human contact. He spoke of bread, water, and a wooden horse as if these were nearly the whole world. If true, his emergence was horrifying. It meant a human being had been grown in secret, then released into society as if dropped from nowhere. Nuremberg did not know what to make of him. Some people pitied him immediately. Others suspected a trick. He appeared young, vulnerable, and deeply unformed in some ways, yet capable of odd flashes of competence in others. He knew how to sign his name. He could say he wanted to be a cavalryman like his father. But he seemed overwhelmed by common sights, uncomfortable with ordinary movement, and childlike in ways that did not fit his apparent age. The city authorities placed him under supervision and began trying to understand him. The first question was simple. Was he telling the truth about total isolation? The second question was darker. If he was, who had done this to him and why? What made the case so difficult was that total isolation of the kind Kaspar described should have left catastrophic damage, yet he did not seem entirely broken. He learned quickly. He acquired language at a pace that surprised some observers. He adapted, formed relationships, and became able to speak about himself with more coherence over time. This could be taken as evidence that he had not truly been isolated to the degree claimed. But it could also be read another way. Perhaps he had not lived in perfect silence, only in extreme confinement and deprivation. Perhaps he had been handled just enough to survive, just enough to remain controllable, and then abandoned when keeping him hidden became too dangerous. The problem with Kaspar Hauser is that the middle ground is often more frightening than either extreme. A total fabrication is easy to dismiss. A half-hidden child shaped by deliberate secrecy is much harder to forget. As he settled into public life, Kaspar offered fragments of memory that fueled the mystery without ever closing it. He spoke of lying on straw, receiving food and water, and encountering a man who began teaching him a few words and movements before releasing him. He described the outside world as something almost unimaginable before his appearance in Nuremberg. Some listeners were deeply moved by these accounts. Others noticed inconsistencies and wondered whether suggestion, coaching, and attention were shaping his recollections. Memory under trauma is unstable even in the best conditions. Memory in a person suddenly transformed into a public curiosity is even less reliable. Kaspar was not telling his story in private to one trusted investigator. He was telling it under the pressure of fame, scrutiny, and political rumor. That alone guarantees distortion, even before deception enters the picture. The political rumors arrived quickly and never truly left. One of the most famous theories claimed that Kaspar Hauser was not merely a hidden child, but a member of the Baden Grand Ducal family, perhaps the true hereditary prince switched out in infancy to alter succession. In this telling, he was raised in secret because his existence threatened power. If he were known, dynastic legitimacy might be shaken. To supporters of this theory, his strange upbringing made terrible sense. He had not been hidden out of random cruelty, but because someone feared what his identity would mean. This theory gave the mystery exactly what legends love most: royalty, conspiracy, and a motive large enough to justify years of silence. It also made Kaspar Hauser far more valuable dead or discredited than alive. The Baden theory was never easy to prove, but it was emotionally irresistible. Europe was full of dynastic tensions, inheritance disputes, and political marriages. Courts had both motive and precedent for concealment, if not always in such extreme forms. If a child stood between powerful figures and succession, it was not absurd to imagine that the child might be removed, substituted, or buried under paperwork. Yet here too the evidence never settled. Supporters pointed to timing, court intrigue, physical resemblance claims, and later suspicious incidents in Kaspar's life. Skeptics replied that the theory was stitched together from wishful leaps and retrospective pattern-making. Like so much else in the case, it remained possible enough to haunt history and uncertain enough to prevent agreement. Kaspar Hauser became a mirror. People saw in him either a damaged victim of crime or the missing piece of a royal deception. His daily life after arriving in Nuremberg only deepened the ambiguity. Kaspar was passed through different households and guardians, some better suited to care for him than others. He attracted protectors, teachers, critics, and opportunists. He also struggled. Adjusting to society after an allegedly inhuman childhood would have been difficult under any circumstances. Doing so while being examined like a living puzzle made it nearly impossible. He was expected to be both authentic and consistent, innocent and articulate, traumatized and useful as evidence. Every social mistake he made could be read as a sign of damage or a sign of fraud. Every inconsistency in his story could be blamed on manipulation, mental confusion, or lying. He lived inside a demand few people could survive cleanly: prove your impossible life in a form others find acceptable. Then the violence began. In 1829, Kaspar claimed he had been attacked in the cellar of the house where he was staying. He reported that a hooded man had struck him on the forehead and threatened to kill him. The wound was real. The meaning was not. Supporters saw this as proof that someone wanted him silenced before he could fully reveal who he was. Skeptics suggested he may have injured himself, whether for attention, out of confusion, or for reasons no one around him understood. The attack transformed the tone of the mystery. Kaspar was no longer only a strange arrival. He was now a possible target. If someone truly had tried to kill him, then the conspiracy theory gained terrifying strength. If he staged the attack, then the fraud theory gained ground instead. Again, the case split cleanly in two, and both readings seemed to feed on the same evidence. This pattern would repeat with exhausting cruelty. Kaspar's defenders tended to interpret each new threat or anomaly as confirmation that hidden forces were hunting him. His detractors saw the same events as evidence that he was manipulative, unstable, or desperate to preserve a fading mystique. The difficulty for historians is that either framework can contaminate everything that follows. Once a person is publicly labeled a victim of conspiracy, suspicious incidents gather symbolic weight. Once he is labeled a self-dramatizer, real danger becomes easier to dismiss. Kaspar lived in that trap. Even if he was in genuine danger, half the world was prepared to say he invited suspicion. Even if he exaggerated, the possibility of a deeper plot never entirely disappeared. One of the most influential figures in his life was Anselm von Feuerbach, a respected jurist who became convinced that Kaspar was the victim of a terrible crime and possibly of high birth. Feuerbach took the case seriously and helped shape its moral and legal importance. To him, Kaspar was not just a curiosity but a challenge to justice itself. If a child could be hidden, deprived, released, attacked, and possibly hunted while authorities failed to uncover the truth, then society had revealed something rotten about its own ability to protect the vulnerable. Feuerbach's support mattered because it gave the case intellectual weight. Yet even his advocacy contributed to the legend. Once a serious mind endorsed the possibility of enormous hidden wrongdoing, the idea that Kaspar might stand at the center of a buried political crime became harder to contain. As Kaspar grew older, his image became more unstable. The innocent foundling story remained powerful, but cracks widened. Some observers felt he was vain, inconsistent, or increasingly aware of the emotional power his own mystery gave him. Others argued this was an unfair expectation placed on a damaged young man who had never been allowed to develop normally. A traumatized person can be difficult, self-interested, contradictory, and still be telling the truth about the core violence done to him. This is one of the reasons the case has aged so well as a mystery. Modern audiences understand more clearly than many 19th-century observers that victimhood does not produce saintliness. But that same insight makes certainty harder, not easier. Kaspar could be both unreliable and genuinely wronged. The categories do not cancel each other out. The second major violent incident came in 1833, and this is the one that made the story immortal. By then Kaspar was living in Ansbach under the supervision of officials who had become more skeptical of him. In December of that year he returned with a stab wound, claiming he had been lured to a garden by a stranger promising new information about his identity. According to Kaspar, the man then attacked him. A small purse or note was supposedly left behind with a cryptic message. At first the wound did not appear immediately fatal, but his condition worsened, and he died a few days later. He was 21 years old, or close to it. With that death, the mystery hardened. If he had been murdered, then someone succeeded in erasing him before the truth surfaced. If he had wounded himself accidentally or deliberately, then the final act of his life was still wrapped in confusion. Either way, the grave did not solve anything. The circumstances of the fatal stabbing remain one of the cruelest puzzles in the whole story. Those who believed in a plot saw the garden attack as the final silencing of a dangerous witness or hidden heir. Those who doubted him pointed to the nature of the wound and the inconsistencies around the event as evidence that he might have inflicted it himself and then misjudged its seriousness. The official verdicts and commentaries over time leaned in different directions depending on who was interpreting them. This is not just a conflict over one injury. It is the entire Kaspar Hauser mystery condensed into one moment. Was he hunted, or was he the architect of his own legend until the end? There are historical cases where the answer can be separated cleanly. Here, the fog never lifts enough. His death ensured that later generations would keep rebuilding him. A living Kaspar could disappoint people. A dead Kaspar could only deepen. The more documents were reread, the more the unresolved pieces multiplied. Why was he released in the first place if someone had worked so hard to keep him hidden? Why did he carry letters that almost seemed designed to create a mystery? Why were the alleged attackers never convincingly identified? Why did his abilities improve in ways that seemed inconsistent with total deprivation? Why did the royal theory remain plausible to some despite lacking conclusive proof? And why did his life feel scripted by an invisible author who wanted the broad outlines known but the center missing? Few cases are so perfect at generating questions that remain just beyond decisive evidence. Modern scholars tend to approach Kaspar Hauser with more caution than the 19th century did. The dramatic royal theories are treated skeptically, though not always dismissed as impossible. Psychological interpretations are also more careful now. Rather than declaring him simply mad, fraudulent, or pure victim, historians look at the social machinery around him, the hunger for sensation, the politics of German states, the instability of memory, the treatment of trauma, and the way public curiosity can shape a life into performance whether the person intends it or not. In that framework, Kaspar becomes even more tragic. He may have been the victim of a crime, but he was also consumed by the need to explain that crime in public. The world did not merely rescue him. It turned him into a contested symbol. Then there is the letter problem. The notes that accompanied his appearance seem at once useful and suspiciously convenient. They provide a framework for his life while also raising obvious doubts. If someone wanted to dispose of a hidden child anonymously, why create a narrative instead of erasing him completely? If someone wanted to launch a deception, however, a letter would be the perfect tool. It would guide interpretation while preserving distance. The letters do not prove either scenario. They merely show that Kaspar's entry into society was mediated from the start. Someone, whether a captor, guardian, manipulator, or accomplice, wanted him seen in a certain way. That alone is unsettling. Before the public ever heard Kaspar's own account, a script was already waiting for him. At the same time, there are powerful reasons to doubt the grandest interpretations. The amount of coordination required to hide a royal child for years, release him unpredictably, and then continue suppressing him through clumsy violence would be enormous. Conspiracies involving many people tend to leave more debris than the Kaspar Hauser case does. Courts can be secretive, but they are also porous. Servants gossip. Rivals leak. Paperwork multiplies. The silence around Kaspar is in some ways too abstract for a vast dynastic plot. That pushes some historians back toward smaller explanations. Perhaps he was the child of an ordinary but scandalous liaison. Perhaps he was abused by obscure guardians. Perhaps he had a real but non-royal secret that later generations elevated because royalty flatters mystery. In that reading, the story became majestic only after the fact.
Yet the anti-conspiracy explanation has its own weakness.
It often fails to explain why the case attracted so much intensity from intelligent contemporaries who had direct access to the people and context around him.
Not every 19th century observer was a fool seduced by melodrama.
Some were careful, educated, and still believed something profound and criminal lay behind Kaspar's story.
They may have been wrong.
But dismissing them too casually leaves the case feeling artificially flattened. Perhaps the truth was not that Kaspar was a prince, but that he was close enough to some significant secret to produce real danger and real alarm.
Again, the middle ground returns. Less cinematic than a hidden heir. More disturbing than a mere imposter.
Kaspar Hauser also survives because his story touches something broader than one identity puzzle.
He represents the fear of being made by confinement.
Most mysterious foundlings ask who this person really was.
Kaspar asks a harsher question. What happens to a human being shaped in secret before entering society?
If he truly spent years in darkness and control, then the greatest crime in the story was not only concealment but construction.
Someone did not merely hide him.
Someone edited the conditions under which his mind could form. That possibility gives the case a kind of philosophical horror.
A missing prince is a political drama. A person manufactured through deprivation is something colder.
What may be most telling is that Kaspar Hauser still provokes emotional argument rather than calm classification. Truly solved cases may interest historians, but they no longer ignite the same friction.
Kaspar still does.
Mention him, and people immediately divide into camps.
He was obviously a fraud. He was obviously a victim.
He was clearly a prince. He was clearly disturbed. When a case can still pull certainty out of incomplete evidence this strongly, it usually means the mystery has touched something psychologically deep.
Kaspar Hauser is not only about a boy in Nuremberg.
He is about how much people are willing to infer from pain, performance, and political possibility. The evidence remains slippery.
The need to decide remains powerful.
And that is why his death feels so bleak. If he was telling the truth, he escaped one prison only to die before the world believed him cleanly. If he was lying or embellishing, then he was still a profoundly damaged young man destroyed inside a role that fed on public fascination.
Either version is tragic.
Either version leaves room for violence.
Either version explains why the story never fully settles into a neat moral shape.
Kaspar Hauser is not a comforting mystery where the unknown itself is romantic.
His unknown is cruel.
It suggests a life stolen before it could become ordinary, and then contested so fiercely that even the victim's reality became part of the battleground. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that Kaspar Hauser was both less and more than the grand legend promised.
He may not have been the rightful Prince of Baden. He may never have stood one revelation away from reshaping European dynastic history. But he was almost certainly not just a harmless trickster dropped into the public square by accident.
Too many aspects of his story remain jagged, violent, and unnaturally arranged for that easy ending.
The letters, the injuries, the attacks, the divided testimony, the political excitement, and the unresolved death all point toward a life entangled with concealment in one form or another. Maybe the monarchy-size theories are too large. Maybe the fraud theories are too small. Kaspar Hauser endures because the truth seems to live somewhere in the dark space between them. So who was Kaspar Hauser really? A hidden heir. A manipulated victim.
A damaged young man who learned to survive inside the mystery others built around him. A foundling whose past was partly real and partly unrecoverable. History cannot answer in one clean sentence. But it can leave us with the detail that matters most. One day a young man stepped into Nuremberg as if delivered from nowhere, carrying almost no verifiable past and triggering decades of fear, pity, and speculation. He was observed, taught, doubted, attacked, and buried. Nearly 2 centuries later, the simplest question is still the hardest one.
Not why people talked about him. Not why stories grew around him.
But who had the power to make a human being emerge into the world already wrapped in secrecy? That is why Kaspar Hauser still haunts history. The boy may have appeared suddenly, but whatever happened to him began long before anyone saw him walking through the city gate. Subscribe to Shadow Archive for more dark history documentaries.